Hello there. Good morning, boys and girls. I am here to just give you a general overview of the doctors of the church. Unfortunately, we did not meet all of them, but we met a good portion of them, and I thought it would be a good idea to just get a general overview about the doctors, something you can keep in your back pocket, because as Catholics, we can never know enough about these great men and women. So let's just make some general observations as we wrap up the doctors. In the 14th chapter of John, Jesus tells his apostles that the Holy Spirit will come, who the Father will send in my name. And he says he will teach you everything and remind you of everything I've said. I think that word remind is extremely important. That is what the Holy Spirit does. He teaches us something and then he reminds us. And that is how it is in the life of the church. Revelation is closed, but different saints at different eras teach us things at the time that we need it. We can see that in our own lives. And so there's a church historian I really like. His name's Bernard McGann. And this is how he explains the doctors and the church. He says, if we take the message of John's gospel seriously, the doctor of the church is actually the Spirit sent in Jesus's name to the community. And he's there again, like those gathered in the upper room at the Last Supper. All subsequent teaching is rooted in the Holy Spirit as the living inner source of the instruction delivered to humanity through Jesus. So it's the Holy Spirit continuing to guide us. What are some requirements to be a doctor of the church? We talked about some of these in August. Let's just do a quick review. To be a doctor of the church, essentially, of course, you have to be a saint. But to be a saint isn't enough. You also have to deepen the whole church's understanding of the Catholic faith with eminent teaching. So think about it. There are literally thousands of saints, but there are only 36 doctors of the church. It's a small number. So you can't just live the faith, you have to broaden our understanding. Third, a pope must traditionally declare you a doctor. Now, technically, an ecumenical council of bishops could name someone a doctor, but that's never happened before. It doesn't mean it won't happen, but it has not happened yet. And when the Pope names someone a doctor of the church, he is recognizing something the Holy Spirit has already done. He's not inventing, he's recognizing, okay? Now, keep in mind, this doesn't mean everything the doctors ever said or wrote is true. In fact, the doctors frequently disagreed with each other. Only the writers of the Bible have this inerrancy in their writings, okay? So for example, St. Thomas Aquinas disagreed with St. Bonaventure about whether or not Mary was conceived without sin. 600 years later, when Pope Pius IX formally said the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception is authentic, the church clearly sided with Bonaventure. But at the time, because the doctrine wasn't formally defined, Aquinas had the freedom to disagree, okay? Now, we're talking about what the doctors of the church are. Let's talk about what they're not. And I've mentioned this in some previous teachings. They are never an apostle and they are never a martyr. Now, it's not like we have this written down. What's interesting about the church, we're very Roman. So if you study Roman history, it's going to be very different from, let's say, American history. American history, we have our Constitution written down. The Roman Constitution is more about precedent, and that's how the Catholic Church is. It's not like we don't have this rule, but we have never named a martyr a doctor of the church. Now, you never know. It could happen, but in our tradition thus far, it has not happened. You know, it's just not fully fleshed out why. Now, if we had named some martyrs as doctors, we would most likely have Polycarp or Ignatius, the early Ignatius, not Ignatius of Loyola. We would have probably Pope Saint Clement, and of course, one of my favorites, Saint Irenaeus. So these are men that loom large, but they are not doctors of the church. An interesting thing about the 20th century, we have 10 new doctors in the 20th century, and 3 of them are women, and that's the first time women are included. The first woman who's declared a doctor is Saint Teresa of Avila. Then we have Saint Catherine of Siena, and then, of course, Saint Terez of Lisieux. Up until that point, every other doctor of the church had some official teaching role, like a bishop, a priest, or a deacon. By naming these 3 women as doctors, the church made it clear that the charism of doctor does not necessarily have to be given to someone with an official teaching role. So, in other words, the charism is separate from this hierarchical function of the magisterium. The Holy Spirit can bestow it on anyone, ordained, religious, or lay. And I like to think about how the Holy Spirit has been developing this doctrine. When we look at John Paul II and he naming Saint Terez, the little flower, a doctor of the church. If you read carefully the Pope's writings, it's very interesting because naming Terez a doctor was controversial because she was not a scholar. She did not leave a large body of writings. She wasn't well educated. A lot of people got upset. John Paul II said, if you look at Terez's autobiography and her letters, as I know you all well know, she's promised that she would start to do her best work after she died. You know, she said something like about leaving a shower of roses. She's going to get to work when she gets to heaven. She's not going to rest when she gets to heaven. So John Paul II said this is new. He said, we don't have other saints who say this. And he said, for our times, this is a new concept we need to understand. So we need gifted theologians to research this. So you can see with Terez, it's a development of doctrine. It's very interesting. If we look at the 36 doctors of the church, we can see some commonalities. First off, many of them, the majority of them, combated heresies either inside the church or within their own religious order. Very interesting. Many of them were exiled. We talked about Athanasius going into exile. So did Cyril of Jerusalem, John Chrysostom, John of the Cross, Francis de Sales. A lot of them were exiled. Many of them founded a religious order or reformed a religious order. We see that essential element in many of them. Last but not least, every doctor left behind some record of his or her teachings. Now, that comes in different ways. For example, of course, some of them wrote enormous works, books, okay? Obviously, we're going to think of Aquinas and Bonaventure. We could also think of Francis de Sales. And one of our newest saints is John of Avila. He has large body of writings. But then some of them wrote catechisms. St. Peter Canisius wrote no less than 3. And then we have some who wrote what you might want to call maybe pagan writings. Isidore of Seville gave us his huge encyclopedia. Albert the Great wrote the first systematic commentary in the Latin West on Aristotle's physics. Bede the Venerable, he wrote the history of the English-speaking people. Some of them excelled at poetry. Do you remember the very first doctor that we met back in August? Ephraim the Syrian, the harp of the Holy Spirit. He wrote 400 poems and hymns. So that's one thing to consider. Finally, some of the doctors were better preachers than writers, so their sermons are left behind. I remember teaching you about Cyril's catechetical lectures. Those sermons are famous, and we read them especially during Holy Week. So these are just a few points to kind of tie up together these exciting doctors that we've met. I hope that you'll choose one and really get to know them. One historian says they are the great explorers, the Lewis and Clarks of holiness. They make notes about their journey for those of us who want to follow after them. Isn't that a neat way to put it? So remember, in closing, the 36 doctors of the church, they're not just names, They're not just on your liturgical calendar. They are our friends, our teachers, our spiritual mothers and fathers. So let's get to know them. And hopefully this is just a tiny little introduction for you. Okay? Thank you for being with me this year. May the doctors of the church watch over us and Holy Child.